Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone. My name is Munal. I'm an assistant professor at the College of Education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. And today I would be walking you through my experience in publishing my dissertation. And I'll talk a little bit about my dissertation and the findings that I have found. But I'll also talk about some tricks and tips to get your research published in Q1 journals, hopefully, inshallah. I see a lot of the names. I actually recognize most of the names, so welcome. And if you have any questions, please do ask me. I'll dedicate around 15 minutes after the presentation or the workshop for more questions, but even throughout, please do ask any question at any time in the chat box. Okay, oops, all right. So to start with your dissertation experience, it really starts with a research proposal. And you have to think about the topic. The topic is of great importance. It needs to be timely. It needs to be trendy. It needs to be current. It also needs to be related. You're talking about something that has to do within your local community or your context, but other wider readership, especially international readership, need to relate to, if not all of the aspects of your dissertation or research, they need to relate to some aspects at least in order for it to be publishable. It also needs to be researchable. A lot of times we come with a lot of great ideas about topics, questions, proposal, but sometimes these are not feasible within the time that we have, or the methodology can be a little bit tricky, or it can be a little bit difficult to actually run the study or run the research. So it also needs to be researchable. So talking about my own experience, I was very much influenced by some of the readings that I had done through my PhD. In particular, the works of Heath, 1983, Ways with Words. Those of you who are in the midst of your PhD studies, if you are taking any courses, probably with Dr. Najmuddin that has to do with social literacy, then you have most probably have come across this particular work. It was very revolutionary for its time, and in fact, it actually promoted, and it actually was, the legs up for a lot of other research within this realm of literacy. I was also very influenced by the work of James Paul Gee, particularly social linguistics and literacy. Again, the ideas that Gee put forth in terms of literacy, what it means, how is it social, what do we mean by discourse, all of those big questions relevant to literacy was very, very influential to me. When I was also trying to think about my proposal, I also come across one particular research proposal. It wasn't a dissertation, it was a proposal that had to do with literacy. Literacy practices among Sudanese refugee families by Kristen Perry. I wanted to know, how do other students construct their proposals, construct their questions? So those particular topics were very influential towards my own study. I read a lot of journals as well, 3 journals in particular. If any one of you is in language and literacy, those 3 journals are of great importance. The Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy, Reading Research Quarterly, and Literacy, which is a journal by Wiley. So those, again, were very important. So then I sat down, I thought of my questions, I came up with a proposal, I defended my proposal. My proposal, to say the very least, it was passable. It wasn't great, it wasn't, it had a lot of work, it had a lot of challenges, and I was asked a lot of questions. One of the challenges that I personally faced when I worked on my proposal was the lack of statistics. I really didn't have much statistics published within the context of the United Arab Emirates to help me out for my problem. Because, you know, whenever you think about a proposal or a study, you have to think of a problem. But unfortunately, there was a little bit of a dearth of studies and statistics and data about this particular topic. So that was one challenge. Another challenge was really to convince the panel members and my advisors of the study's merits. You know, and a lot of questions was really had to do with the topic itself, like, why are you looking at this particular topic? And one thing that I have learned from that experience is that as researchers, we really need to contextualize our studies in a way that others who are non-readers of the same discourse or non-readers of the same topics that we have read would understand it in very simplified terms. So make things as explicit as possible. Most of the panels on panel members on your proposal or on your dissertation, they wouldn't necessarily be experts on your topic. They would be experts around the subject area, but not necessarily the topic. So things have to be very explicitly expressed in your study in order for them to see the significance of, or the merits of your study. I had a lot of questions that was targeted towards the orientation of the study, which was a qualitative study. And again, experts would come with a variety of different expertise in terms of research orientation. You have people who are well-versed in quantitative, maybe mixed methods, maybe qualitative. So things need to be very explicitly explained in order for everyone to understand the purpose of the study. I had a lot of questions about the methodology, special questions about the participants. Why am I, for example, including students but not including parents? Why am I including, for instance, students but not teachers? So a lot of justification as well need to be put into a proposal. So to say the very least about my own personal experience, it was a passable proposal, but it went through a lot of changes as well. So then I took all those comments into consideration, and I thought about my study, and I formed the following questions in my dissertation. What are the literacy practices of UAE high school students in schools? What are their literacy practices outside the realm of the school, and how, if any, are these practices rhizomatic? I was very much influenced by the philosophy of the rhizome. So because I was looking at literacy in a very broad manner, I had to think of a philosophical assumption that was going to embrace this thought. And I'm very thankful for my advisor who showed me some works by Deleuze and Guattari that had to do with the philosophy of the rhizome. And the philosophy of the rhizome basically tells you that, you know, literacy can be understood as very broad. It can be understood as being chaotic, as being, you know, intermingled. Outside literacy is related to inside literacy, to functional literacy. So, you know, it's very intricate, it's very complex, it's unpredictable, it's non-linear. So the philosophy of the rhizome, it actually comes from the botanic science of plants. And a rhizome is a root that grows underground. And as it grows, it will shoot roots from its node. So it causes this very intricate, very intertangled mass of product. And to me, this is how I wanted to study literacy. I wanted to study literacy within the United Arab Emirates, but it's in its very raw, intricate, non-linear manner or shape. For my theoretical framework, I had to go with the Multiliteracies framework because the Multiliteracies framework, and this was established by the New London Group, they also thought that literacy is not only reading and writing, that literacy includes, you know, multimodality. It embraces the idea of diversity in language, but also diversity in culture. It's multimodal. In order to make meaning, you're not only inclined to use reading and writing, but you can use different modes of meaning. For example, gestures, symbols, pictures, videos, sound, and so on. And this is the kind of framework that I wanted to include in my study. Important keyword as well in my study, because when you think about, again, a publishable research, you also have to think about the wider keywords. Where do you place your study under? And a very important keyword for my study was adolescent literacy in particular. So I was looking at the very different literacy practices that adolescents in the United Arab Emirates engaged in, whether this was in school or it was out of school, whether it was, in a space in between. So it explores, adolescent literacy is a very wide research area that explores how adolescents form very complex, intricate relationships that consolidate and make sense of the world that they live in. Important, again, it's a very wide area. There's a lot of research, but one of the themes that really is concurrent in all of those studies with adolescent literacy has to do with choice and agency. It has to do with social membership and solidarity, how it is very important for adolescents to form parts of a group, to be part of a network when they do engage in different kinds of literacies. Methodology, the study adopts a concurrent and qualitative driven mixed method approach. I really had to use quantitative, even though, my philosophical assumption and my theoretical framework were driven towards a more purely qualitative work. I had to do a little bit of a quantitative study as well, because remember, I told you I did not have any statistics, any data, any published work that was going to help me contextualize my study. So I thought I might as well do it myself. I need to, have some kind of a data that's going to help me understand the nature of literacy and the nature of the kinds of literacy practices that adolescents in the United Arab Emirates engage in. So I did that through a survey that was distributed among 531 participants. They were all high school students in public schools around different cities and different emirates in the United Arab Emirates. I also conducted in-depth interviews, and that was the bulk. The bulk of my study really relied on the interviews and the qualitative part rather than the quantitative part. So I conducted 9 in-depth interviews with 9 participants. Again, all of them were high school students from grade 10 all the way to grade 12, who were in different emirates in different states in public high schools, enrolled in public high schools. And at the time, some of them were art students and some of them were science students. One student only who was under the very newly established general track. So there's also the quantitative studies. The volumes of, I found through the surveys that the volumes of academic and non-academic books owned by high school families and high schoolers' families were found to be low. The students reported having around 51 to 50 books maximum in their households. The number of books owned by the participants themselves were also found to be low. So again, they reported having 1 to 50 books in their households. And the number of books read by the participants for academic purposes and for leisure were also found to be low. It was 10 to 20 academic books and 10 to 20 non-academic books as well. So the number of books that were so the number of books that were reported by the students were quite low. The participants prefer to discuss their various literacy practices with their friends rather than discuss some of the things that they have read or some of the things that they have watched or even the video games that they have played. They prefer to discuss them with their friends rather than discussing them with their family, teachers, or even siblings. Teachers, unfortunately, were chosen as the last option by high schoolers as someone with whom they might feel comfortable discussing their different literacy practices, be it a novel, a book, a comic book, a video game, even a movie. So they were chosen as, you know, the last sort of resort, or the last person that they would think of sharing these things with, which really goes to show as well, like, unfortunately, the lack of rapport that some students and teachers have in our schools and in our context, where students don't feel comfortable talking about, you know, other elements other than academia or other than things having to do with school with their teachers. So that was the quantitative part. For the qualitative part, if we look at students inside school literacy practices, the things that they did in school, their students inside school practices is very conventional. Students are very aware of the conventions and the uniformed guidelines that they have to follow. They would follow or practice very identifiable stages and predictable sequences in order to do well in their classes. They talked, for instance, or they gave examples of working on a SEPA, for example. Back in the days, there was SEPA instead of MSAT. A SEPA writing assignment, or for example, preparing for the IELTS for college. And they talked about how it was very important to follow guidelines in order to meet the task requirements. And how, for instance, you know, if they didn't do that necessarily, they wouldn't be able to pass the certain band necessary for college entry. A lot of students, particularly the female students, they talked about the irrelevance of some of the textbooks. Particularly, again, the female students, they indicated through the interviews that they found a lot of the topics in their textbooks irrelevant to what was happening in their life outside the school, or what was happening in society as a whole. They thought that the topics included in their textbooks were a little bit outdated, and so they also gave examples. One student said, for instance, why don't we have important topics that has to do with our community? And she gave an example of Dubai, Expo 2020. She said, this is a very important event that is going to happen soon. So why don't we talk about this, a future event, rather than talking about a past event that happened and it, that has finished and it is done. Students also talk about relevance of text. So the relevance really was determined by their engagement within the school. If it was relevant, it had to do with their life, they saw meaning through this task, they would be engaged to participate, they would be much more inclined to exert a lot of effort and time in it. If it wasn't, then they would do the minimum in order to pass this particular task, or pass the grade or pass the class as well. Another theme that was also found through the qualitative study was that whenever permissible, students would weave parts of their life outside the school into their literacy practices inside the classroom. So whenever they found ways to include their outside literacy practices in schools, they would do it if permissible. One student in particular talked about how in their Arabic class they had to write a biography, and he chose to write a biography about his favorite author. And he said how much it has taught him a lot about the author that he enjoys reading, because he had to do a lot of research and it was very meaningful for him. And he thought it was, it gave him a sense of an achievement as well. For students outside school literacy practices, there was the theme of reading for pleasure. Our students do indeed read for pleasure. Students discussed their engagement with reading prose, poetry, and reading a wide variety of genres. They indicated to reading self-help books. A lot of students indicated to reading fantasy and fiction. Some read novels, some are interested in nonfiction, so they do read for pleasure. But one of the interesting things that I found through the interviews, not the surveys, is for some reason, students don't identify themselves as readers. Like if you ask them, are you a reader? Students would tell you, no, actually, I don't read a lot. And this also tells me whether, you know, the quantitative part of the study you know, the qualitative part of the study refutes the quantitative part, because in the quantitative part, students have indicated that they do not read and that they own a lot of, they own very little books in their households. But through the qualitative studies, it was something completely different. This is a very interesting finding that I found. One particular participant, when I asked him, do you identify yourself as a reader? He said, no, I actually don't read a lot. I don't consider myself a reader. And he said, I actually wrote that in your survey because I had given them the survey before doing the interview. And I said, okay. And then through our discussion, he told me that he reads manga. These are Japanese graphic novels. He reads summaries of Marvel comic books on Wikipedia, because he says he wants to get in touch with all of the updates before watching the movies. He also indicated that he learned recently about Tintin from his father. He collected some books in Dubai, which is not the city he resides in. And then he also collected some of the books when he had traveled to, I think he said Belgium, if I'm not mistaken. And he also said that he was playing a video game that was made into 3 installments. And the third installment was actually a graphic novel. So I was really astounded by the amount of reading that he was done. And even though he does read, he doesn't consider it to be reading. And that also tells us a little bit about what kind of messages as teachers and educators do we send to our students about reading, that they, even when they do, they don't consider themselves to be readers. Does reading have to be nonfiction? Do we really have to read Shakespeare in order to be considered readers? Do we need to read nonfiction or encyclopedias to be considered readers? So this identifying oneself as a reader or non-reader, literate or non-literate, was very, very interesting. Through the interviews, it was also found that students do engage in writing for pleasure. They engage in writing prose, poetry, and some also write tweets, like inspirational tweets. Most of their writing for pleasure or writing activities were also found to be private activities rather than public activities. Students did not feel comfortable sharing their poetry or sharing some of the novels or stories that they were attempting to write because they didn't think it was good enough at this stage. And basically, you know, they wanted to keep it to themselves. Of course, our adolescent students, they also engaged with pop culture. Their literacy practices are entrenched with their pop culture, you know, video games, TV shows, cosplaying, reading mangas, watching anime, all of those different activities that they engage in outside of the school. When it comes to the sense of achievement, that was another question that I asked the participants through the interviews. You know, what is a piece of a literacy practice that you feel proud of, whether it was outside of school or inside the school? And a very interesting theme was that students would consider a certain literacy practice an accomplishment if they had choice of working on that particular practice, and if they considered it to be unique, meaning different than any other product that their siblings or fellow students or any other person around them had produced. So choice, again, is very important. It comes up as a theme in the literature review. It also came up as a theme within the study, is having the choice to choose something to write about, to choose something to read about, to choose something to engage in, give students a sense of accomplishment and also uniqueness, diverting from what usually is asked of students, doing something that is different, not only in comparison to others, but also in comparison to themselves, like doing something that they hadn't done before or they hadn't attempted to do before, also contributed to their sense of achievement. However, for most of the participants, though, a sense of achievement is still very much tied to the school. So most of the things that they said they were proud of had to do with school, had to do with getting high grades, a really good mark, passing a certain assessment, or passing, for example, the IELTS, the CEPA, and so on. So it was still very much tied with whatever it is that they were doing inside the school. Another important finding that I haven't written really here down, but I think is very also important, was that our students did not think that there was a space for them in school to practice all of those different kinds of literacy practices other than reading and writing in school. They did not believe that there was room for that sort of practice or that sort of activity to take place. And again, which takes us to important applications, like what can we do to promote students to practice their different literacies inside the scope of the school, in order for them, not to separate themselves. At this point, it's still very much separated. The things that they do in school, it only belongs in school, and the things that they do outside the school, it only belongs at home or in different spaces. They do not merge. And it's very, very little that they do. And when they do, they merge or they interweave or they form a knotted loop quite incidentally, by accident. It doesn't really happen because the teacher or the curriculum was intended for them to bring on their, part of their lives and part of their culture into the classroom as well. So this calls for important implications as well in the way in which we teach, in our pedagogy, in our curriculum design, even in the way that we run our classrooms. I always say to my students, at least if the curriculum doesn't provide that space, we as teachers can provide that space in our classrooms for students to talk about the things that they are interested in, and any pop cultural activity that they engage in, anything that makes meaning to them needs to make meaning inside the classroom as well. Okay, so then remember, half of this talk or workshop really talks about how to make or how to take your dissertation and make a publication out of it. Important questions to ask is, why do I need to publish a dissertation? You will come across a lot of people who will tell you, making an article out of your dissertation is not going to help you in the long run in terms of promotion. It doesn't count as part of your tenure. It doesn't count as part of your academic promotion and so on. So why bother? Why spend some time working on it? But I beg to differ. First of all, this work, your dissertation, would be highly, highly scrutinized by a panel of experts. It has been written, revised, edited, proofread by so many different people that it really has a higher chances of getting published than working on something solitary by yourself. So there's one. Two, it gives us novice researchers, it really gives us the momentum to engage in scholarly work. It gives you that energy to engage in research rather than to stop and start from scratch and start from the very beginning, where you can lose a little bit of time in that sort of momentum that you need to keep going. It establishes you as a researcher. It puts your name there on the field. It helps with networking. It helps you to understand the language of publication, if I may say so. It helps you to understand what is, what do journals and publishers look for in a research. So it gives you a lot of insight into that. And most importantly, you also contribute to the collective body of the existent literature with regards to the area of your expertise. You give back to the community that you have been invested in. So before publishing, I'll talk about my experience. I had to, basically my research was very big, and it was not only big in terms of size, but also big in terms of scope. When I talked about literacy, I talked about literacy in a very general form. I wanted to know everything about our adolescent students' literacies inside the school, outside the school. What are the different forms? How do they engage in all of these things? So it was quite broad. And again, because I didn't really have any data or any statistics, I really wanted to be, the threshold that others might want to look at when working on their studies here within the context of the United Arab Emirates. So to take my dissertation in its raw form and make it into an article was not really feasible, again, because it was too broad. So I needed to really concentrate and to look at very specific areas and facets of my dissertation that were publishable, that were a little bit more focused and a little bit more concentrated. So my first publication, which was in a Scopus Q1 journal, focused on affinity spaces. Affinity spaces, you will notice I did not talk about it here in my study because I only mentioned it in my literature review. And I didn't really discuss about it in my results or in my discussion, even though it was very important and it was something that I wanted to pursue further. So I took that idea of affinity spaces and I reconstructed my dissertation in a way that was going to fit the main scope of affinity spaces. My second published article had to do with pedagogy, particularly with authentic pedagogy. Now, this is something that I had not included in my dissertation. To be honest, nor was I very familiar with the concept of the framework before really embarking on the writing process. So for my second publication, I looked at the same results that I had and the same study that I had, but I interweaved it with the idea of authentic pedagogy rather than, talking about literacy in general. Of course, when you do that, there are ethical considerations because remember, you promised the participants that you would only be using the results of the study for certain purposes, right? So when you also publish your work, you need to make sure that it is still within the research questions or it still falls within the consent form and the purpose of the study, that you're not veering too away to use the results for something that is completely different than what you intended to when you informed your participants. So there are ethical considerations. Important also to think about is which aspect of your study you are really you want to underscore in your study. Before publishing, you need to find a journal. When we write dissertations, we don't necessarily think of a journal while we are writing because dissertations, and I'll talk a little bit about that, goes through a different writing style, a different writing purpose. The target audience is different. But when you write an article, you really need to target a journal, and a very specific journal. If you talk about it very generally, and then you try, or you, for example, choose a journal to submit to, you will find that you'll have to make a lot of changes in order for your study to fall under their guidelines. So it's important to find a journal, read the guidelines of that journal, make sure that the compatibility of the research also falls under the method and orientation of the journal. Some journals will tell you that, for example, they will accept a certain research orientation or inquiry orientation, either quantitative, qualitative, sometimes both, right? So you need to make sure that, let's say, for instance, if you're doing doing a qualitative study, that this said journal is going to accept qualitative studies. Reading guidelines of the journals or journal articles is important. Journal guidelines, they really direct your, the format of your manuscript. They're going to tell you how to approach it. There are certain languages and certain words that some journals, for instance, do not prefer. For instance, to give you an example, I use the word youth. Here in the United Arab Emirates, in our context, we really use the word youth, shabab, more than we use the word adolescents or young adults. And in this particular journal, they actually asked me to use young adults rather than using the word youth, because it's not something that they feel is internationally understood. So sometimes, they have very certain words or very certain style of writing, if we may say so, that you need to adhere to. Writing for an audience makes it a little bit easier to write as well. So you know who you're addressing. Most journals will tell you, for example, the readership includes teachers, researchers, includes, for example, graduate students, and so on. So you write, again, your manuscript in a way that's going to be read by those audiences in particular. Choose a journal that you are familiar with. It's a good start to start with something that you are familiar with. Journals that you have actually used in your citations, in your dissertation, in your other schoolwork, so that you are familiar with the terms, you are familiar with, the kind of writing style that they include, the sort of organization that they mandate. If not, if you, let's say, for instance, one of the journals that I used to read as a student was Reading Research Quarterly. It's an amazing journal, but it's also in the top 1%. So it's very tough to get into. So rather than, setting my hopes too high, I wanted to start a little bit in the middle. It was still Q1, but it wasn't the Reading Research Quarterly. So I didn't necessarily choose one that I had read. I still used other ones, but if you haven't, or you're not familiar with the journal, then read some articles, examples, or several articles from the published, any published work that they have. Most journals will also have free samples for you to read, even if it's, usually they have like open access of a couple of articles, so you can read those to understand, again, to understand better the requirements of the journal. Get in touch with the journal in case you had any questions about copyright issues. Remember, your dissertation is copyrighted, and depending on your university, it could be, there could be different policies within copyright, or that has to do with copyright. So get in touch with the university library, get in touch with the journals. Some journals will tell you that they don't accept dissertations. I've read some journals that say they don't accept results from published dissertations or other dissertations. So you want to get in touch with those and tell them, what do they mean by that? Do they mean if it's published on the university website, whether it's not, and so on. Most universities here in the United Arab Emirates University, we have an embargo on dissertation. You can stop the publication of your dissertation for a couple of years until you get some work published, so you don't go into the frenzy of copyright and legal issues and so on. So you want to know that before you actually you contact the journal or submit the journal. Okay, so then preparing the manuscript. Preparing a manuscript, you have to remember, just because you have a complete dissertation doesn't mean that you can take bits and pieces and put it in a Word document and send it. Preparing a manuscript from your dissertation actually needs rewriting and reconstructing. It's not an act of summarizing and condensing your study. Why? Because if you do that, remember, you cannot convert 300 odd pages of a dissertation into a minimum of 30 pages without going through changes, because the style is different, the length of the sentences is different. You know, I always think of a dissertation as a manual of sorts, really, because the way in which we write is somehow it follows a certain formula. So there's a very specific way of writing. There's a template. So it's very, very scientific. It really follows a very strict guideline. You can't do that with an article. It's very different. The convention is different. The genre is different, really, and even the writing style in which you write with. Here, it's very explicit. You explain things, you define things. In an article, sometimes you don't have to do that. So when you think of doing that, you have to think that, okay, I'm going to rewrite my dissertation. I'm going to reconstruct it and start anew with the same result that I have, but I have to rewrite it once again. Be aware of copy pasting, again, especially if your dissertation is published on the university website or in the university directory. Just make sure that you don't copy paste. Your manuscript is still going to go through plagiarism mechanisms or platforms. So be sure of that. And I personally honestly feel that if you prepare a manuscript in you, rather than just taking bits and pieces and fitting them together as a piece of puzzle, it really gives you that motivation. It gives you that momentum to work on research, really. But here, at least you have the results of your study, right? It's all the rest of the parts that you really have to think of. Read the instructions for authors very carefully. Most journals, again, all journals have authors' guidelines, and they specify the citation, the sort of, for example, language, even spelling, whether it was American spelling or British spelling system. It would tell you how to cite things. It would also give you information about footnotes and margins and so on. Some journals are very strict. If the margins, for instance, they tell you that if the margins do not fit the ones that they have recommended, they would not look at the paper, they would give it back. So be careful about these things. Most journals, thankfully, though, do have a template. You can use a template. I personally haven't. I use my own Word document and then I go through the guidelines in terms of formatting of the paper, and I make sure that I follow these guidelines. What else? Provide a very rich description of the context. This is something that I have learned from the papers that I have published, is that most journals, and again, remember, we are talking about the context different than, let's say, UK, different than the context in the United States. So they want to understand the context, the demographic, the culture of the participants, particularly if you're talking about qualitative studies. So be ready to describe the context. What do you mean by public schools? What do you mean by model schools? How many students do they have? What is the socioeconomic status of the students? This is a very important question. I got asked these questions a lot of times, like what is the socioeconomic status, which can be a little bit tricky here in this context of the world, where we don't really rely on this much information when we think about education or we think about our classes, unlike in the United States, right? So be ready to give rich description of the context and also about the participants. So when you conduct your study, make sure that you have a rich description of the participants, who they are, what makes meaning to them, what is meaningful to them, what is important to them, what are their activities, and any other description that they might provide in accordance to their identity would be important for the manuscript as well. And yeah, that's about it. And after that, you just, cross your fingers and you send and submit your manuscript. Do we have any questions with regards to anything that we have discussed? Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mayra. Any questions?
I don't have any questions, Dr. Mona, but your presentation was really wonderful, as we're always used to. So I just wanted to thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. That's so kind. That's so kind of you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Hi, Dr. Mona.
Yes, hi.
How are you?
Very well, thank you.
So I've read your dissertation.
You have?
I actually have. And I before reading it, it was referred to me about 1,000 times by Dr. Nejmuddin, who always thought it was the most interesting and amazing thing in the world. And I was like, what's so interesting about this? And then I read it and I was like, interesting.
Okay.
I want to just paraphrase what you said so that I make sure, just to make sure that I understand this idea of using your dissertation or applying aspects of your dissertation towards publication.
Mm-hmm.
is the essential idea that we can use this data that we've collected and modify it to fit specific journals. Is that sort of the essential point?
Yes, it is.
And then we can use that data from different scopes or different perspectives. You talked about affinity spaces. So if you had written your dissertation on literacy practices, then you would take the aspects of affinity spaces and use the data from your dissertation and use it within the scope of affinity spaces. Is that right?
Exactly. That's exactly what I did, because it also came up as part of, it was part of the further research that I wanted to do, but I didn't really have that scope to do it within working on my dissertation.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
You're most welcome. You're most welcome. That's exactly it, Sabahat. Exactly.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Any other questions before we leave?
How can we gain access to your dissertation, Dr. Mona, if you need to read it?
Isn't it available on the university library? Because I was a student at UAE as well.
There is a link on the UAE general website, which lists all the dissertations of all the students that have ever attended and completed their dissertation in every field.
Mm-hmm.
I will check and see where it is, but there is a link on the UAE, on the general UAE website.
Yes, please. If you can share that with the students.
Now. Yes, I'll check now.
Yes, thank you so much. Or otherwise, you can email me. I can always give you a PDF format of it, a PDF copy.
I will. Thank you so much, Dr. Mona. Thank you.
You're most welcome. All right. So if we don't have any questions, thank you so much for your time. And I hope to see your names in Q1 journals, inshallah, sometime soon.